So I'm really excited for this next panel to have the opportunity to have with us here today two of the colleagues of mine here at UBC, Dr. Sheryl Staub-French and Dr. Ninan Abraham. And I'll, just like in the last session, I'll introduce the two of them here at the start and then let Sheryl go first and then Ninan after. And then we'll be using Slido again now that we've gotten the hang of it. Thanks, Trish, for putting the link there in the chat. And so, yeah, so just like before, you'll be able to put some questions in Slido as you're listening to the talks. But let me introduce both of these speakers. So many of you might know Sheryl, since she has been an integral fellow to the consortium since we first got started. But let me give a bit more introduction and background to Sheryl. So Sheryl's a professor of civil engineering. She joined the faculty at UBC in 2002. She had received her PhD at Stanford University. She, in 2019, I believe, was appointed to the Associate Dean of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Faculty of Applied Science. In that capacity, or maybe even before that, I think she was sort of the overseer of Gearing Up, one of our other partners, especially to Project PRISM. And when she's not doing EDI work, she leads up a research team that looks to support the digital delivery of sustainable building projects. But of course, in her EDI capacity, she's really just been doing so much to try to translate, some of the kind of stuff we do on the research side of things to applications within applied science. And in the interim, we're trying to kind of learn from what they're finding is really effective there as well. So really looking forward to hearing her share some of her insights today. Then after Sheryl gives her presentation, we'll hear from Ninan Abraham, who is also a faculty member here at UBC, but in the Faculty of Science. Ninan joined UBC in 2003, I believe. He's a professor in our departments, both of microbiology and immunology and zoology. He does research, among other things, on the cancer of the immune system. His PhD is from the University of Ottawa with a postdoc at UCSF. And he is also an associate dean of equity, diversity, and inclusion, but in the Faculty of Science, where he's had that role since 2018. Let me just sort of share, it's kind of interesting to me, I'm in psychology, as most of you know, and our own department has been trying to sort of understand how to bring in EDI better within our own department over this past year. And so I've had people both inside and outside of our department say to me, you really should bring in Ninan Abraham, who can talk about the work. He's sort of a superstar on campus right now, and has been for a few years, in the work that I think he'll tell you about today, looking at sort of how to boost diversity in hiring. And then other people just even this week were like, you really should look at the website for the Faculty of Applied Science, because they're doing so many great EDI initiatives there. So it's all kind of full circle here. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sheryl to kick us off.
Oh, what a great introduction, Tony. Let me start off by trying to lower some expectations here, maybe. I'm going to do the scariest part of my day, which is try and share my screen and see if this works. Okay, everyone can see it okay? Yes, wonderful. Well, thank you for that introduction. I am going to kind of share some of the lessons learned about our approach for embedding EDII in the Faculty of Applied Science. I'll just say a little bit more about me. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an immigrant and a settler here, originally from California, and I'm joining you from the traditional ancestral and unceded lands of the Coast Salish, Musqueam, and Squamish peoples. It is a pleasure to be here. I have been following along and happy to be joining this research consortium from the very beginning. I always feel like I learn so much every year when I come to this conference. So I'm going to kind of share a little bit about, my adventures in EDI work and applied science. This role of Associate Dean EDI was created in 2019. I was the first person to hold this position, so I got to kind of define the way it was going to be set up. And I latched on to the UBC strategic plan, their language of embedding equity and diversity across university systems and structures. So I really have taken this to heart. This role does support all engineering departments and programs, as well as the schools of nursing, architecture, and planning. So a very diverse group of folks. So I'm going to start by kind of positioning this relative to work that we did in our strategic plan. And this is really where it shows up in terms of how we're embedding EDII. So when I took on this role, it was kind of at the beginning of when we went through this strategic planning process. And it was a very engaged and collaborative process. And this is really kind of how I work as well. It follows kind of the role of our leadership team. And within this, we developed a strategic plan that has 6 priorities. And the priority that I really help to lead is this inclusive leadership and respectful engagement priority. And so this is really where EDII is getting embedded into our faculty. And there's 3 kind of strategies that really capture this work. The first is responding to the TRC calls to action, inclusive, respectful leaders, and really about those competencies that folks need, and then advancing diversity. So this is kind of the framing for the work. And what I did as a good engineer is really try to look at, well, what are our systems and structures? And so really try to map where are all of our units, where are these systems and structures where we can potentially embed EDII. And so did this whole mapping and worked with our leadership team to kind of get at these kinds of systems and where the mechanisms are that we can embed EDII. I also have really been listening a lot to Tony in the group, and this diagram has really helped to frame my approach. So really trying to understand what can we do with individuals, how can we support this sort of interaction component, this engagement component, and then what are these policies and practices that we can kind of use to drive systems and culture change. So this is really kind of the framing, the 2 framing, the systems and culture change framing that we really bring to this work. I'm going to talk specifically about these 4 priority areas. You can see here leadership is quite big, and this has been a big piece of our work. And then really looking at engagement and dialogue, education and training, and access and support. So I'll speak to each of these 4 components. I'm going to do a bit of a fly through, so I'll just kind of highlight some of the things that are sort of representative of the work in this space. But given the time constraints, I won't go into much detail in any one area. So the first is leadership, and I have to say that I am very lucky to be in applied science where we have a dean that is fully supportive of this. So he created this position. I have 2 folks that work with me. I really feel like anytime I come to him with an idea, he's like, yes, I will show up. And he really, models this work. So in terms of faculty level initiatives, we've got several committees that are operating at the faculty level. So we've had this Indigenous Engagement Committee that's been very active since 2016. And this committee is now, taking on the task of figuring out how to implement the Indigenous Strategic Plan. So this is a big part of the work in this portfolio. I also created a new committee, EDI and Engineering Committee, to really get all these different units to come together and really think about how do we do this within all of our units. And last year, we actually had 7 different subcommittees. So there were probably like 40 different people working at different levels across these different sort of structures that we have to advance each one of these separately. This year, I'm very happy to report that we have a new EDI leads and engineering committee. So instead of 7 subcommittees, which was killing me, we've really sort of centralized this. And a big part of this is that we now have an EDI lead representing each of the engineering departments. So there is a person responsible in every engineering department for EDII. And this committee has staff from each unit, as well as some key student leaders as part of it. So this is kind of how a lot of the work gets done. So that is a part of our leadership system. It's the way that we kind of influence and drive initiatives. Another big component that we've focused on is education and training. Now, this is a very complicated piece of it, but I'm just going to highlight a few different things that we've been doing along the way. We've always kind of done EDI training for hiring. We've picked this up a bit. Every single hiring committee gets training. And even if you had it 6 months ago, you still have to do it if you're on a new committee, because it's like about getting this committee to think about equity in hiring. Ninan has tons to say about this, so I won't spend much time on that. The other thing is like doing training for EDI and research, really helping people to think about how to embed EDI in their whole research program, hiring, lab stuff. We've done staff-specific training as well. And we're developing resources to help faculty embed EDI into their curriculum, providing different examples. For students, all of our student leaders now go through the Community Building Education Program. This is the UBC program that really gets at some of the EDI stuff. All of our TAs go through an EDI training as part of their TA training. We've also been implementing graduate student orientation, where specifically professionalism and EDI is addressed. And then now all design teams in engineering, we have like 35 different design teams. They all go through EDI training as well. A really exciting thing this year is that we actually hired Backhow Consulting to do anti-oppression fundamentals training for everyone. And so we had over 500 faculty, staff, and students attend this past term. And that was really great to see that kind of turnout. And then we also had Backhow come in and work with both our faculty leadership team and our staff leadership team. And so last week, all the dean, the associate deans, the heads and associate heads, the EDI leads from all the units came together in a training, and the same thing happened for the staff leadership team as well. So huge training effort this past fall. We're also doing trying to do deep training opportunities. So this was a workshop we did with CTLT around anti-racism in teaching and leadership. So we had like 30 faculty go through this training last year, or I guess in January of this year. It feels like last year or 2 years ago. So this is at deep training. So it's like 12 hours of training. We also did another workshop on embedding indigeneity into curriculum. That was a 9-hour, or I think 10-hour series of workshops that we had. About 25 faculty go through again this year. We're working with research programs. So this is Quantum BC. There's about 30 grad students, 10 faculty, and we're working with them on kind of developing a training program and throughout their timeline. So that's been kind of the education and training piece. So like, how do we keep doing this? And we're doing more trainings. I have another couple of trainings next week. We're just trying to get people aware and engaged in this work. The other thing is we try to have broader events. So last year and this year, we've had a series that really centers on truth and the role of engineers in decolonization and reconciliation. This was a 4-part series. You can actually check it out on our website. They're all recorded series or dialogue series. This past February, we hosted a series of kind of anti-racism listening sessions where a small team of us reached out to Indigenous, Black, and people of color faculty, staff, and students, had different sessions with all of them to try to hear their concerns. We had an open forum where they could submit things online anonymously. And that really helped to inform kind of how we're approaching our anti-racism work. This past September, we put together an intergenerational march for Orange Shirt Day. It was an amazing event. There's a great video actually that goes with it if you want to check it out. It actually ended up being UBC's event. There were hundreds and hundreds of people that showed up, and it was an incredible event. I don't know, I could get weepy thinking about it. So those are some of the things that we've been doing around engagement and dialogue. We have another reconciliation and design dialogue series this year. These are led by Pam Wolf in our civil engineering department and a graduate student, Danilo Caron. We have another one coming up next week. If anyone wants to go, it's open to everyone. And we have Albert Marshall coming, and he talks about two-eyed seeing, which is a really important thing for STEM folks. We also are planning an anti-racism speaker series. So we've got 2 confirmed events. So on February 22nd, we're hosting Drs. Margaret Moss and Mary Ellen Triple-Lafond. And then Cicely Blaine, who is the head of Bacow Consulting. They actually are the founders of Bacow Consulting. They will be speaking on March 22nd. So this is, again, trying to keep that dialogue going. The idea is really to keep it in the air that we breathe, right? How do we just keep it there? How do we keep it top of mind for people and keep having events to kind of remind people to be aware? The last thing I'll say is about access and support. Hopefully everyone knows about Gearing Up. We pivoted last year, and I should just give a shout out to several Gearing Up folks on the line here. Pivoted to online right at the start of COVID, and still were able to offer some great programming. Reached 20,000 youth last year, which is pretty amazing considering COVID restrictions. Really looking at how Gearing Up and those kinds of influences, and you hopefully heard about the research in the video this morning about how you can disrupt people's pathways or change them. And these are some of the testimonials from Gearing Up folks. And then really looking at kind of how does this impact our community. So within Gearing Up, we really try to look at the ecosystem. So teachers, parents, the kids themselves, schools, how do we engage everyone in this? So that's a big shout out to Gearing Up. And then the last thing I'll say is that we're doing a lot more to support kind of equity deserving groups and really helping to create community within the broader engineering community of faculty, staff, and students. So those are some of the key things that we've been focusing on. This is my last slide in case anyone's getting worried about my timing. So I'll just highlight a few of these things. The importance of strong leadership, having a dean that's been, right with me the entire time has been incredible. Really identifying those mechanisms where you can embed, because it's a really important process. I've found that creating a coalition of the willing has been incredibly impactful. A lot of people want to do better, they just don't know how, and finding those people and engaging them is critical. And then having this sort of bottom up and top down approach where you also include the entire ecosystem is really critical. We've also really tried to create safe spaces for leaders. A lot of our leaders are really unsure and hesitant, so helping them to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And then really trying to embed this into our profession. Like, this is part of what makes a great engineer, for example. So with that, I will quickly wrap up and hand it over to my amazing colleague, Ninan.
That's so great. Okay, let me pass it off to Ninan so that we can then hear what's going on in Faculty of Science. Thank you so much, Sheryl.
Let me launch my PowerPoint deck here. Okay, and I'm sharing desktop. I hope that's the right desktop. What are we seeing? No, yeah, wrong one. The wrong one, huh? Okay. Are you seeing the full slide or?
No, it was right the last time, actually.
Okay, swap displays.
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
No, I don't like this because I'm now going to be looking that way, but okay, maybe I won't use the. Hello, everyone. Thank you for that. Tony, I really appreciate the invitation. Sheryl, it's always a difficult act to follow. Every time you show your slides, I think, oh my goodness, we don't even come close. So yeah, Sheryl has all the strengths of my weaknesses, and hopefully I'll have something to add to this conversation. So thank you for having me. My pronouns are him, his. I'm an immigrant settler in the traditional ancestral unceded territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish peoples. Colonialism is not an abstraction in my immediate family. Both my grandparents and parents were in the British Empire and saw independence in both India and Malaya. And so it's not an abstraction, which I feel is important to state because in this in this venue, particularly within the Canadian context, race is rarely spoken about, particularly in my circles in STEM. And so I've had the comment made that Canadians don't understand colonialism and its relevance to social issues. And that is a fundamental issue that needs to be rectified. Okay, so the work I'm going to show you has really been about where our equity gaps are in the Faculty of Science at UBC. And this work was done ably supported by Dr. Carola Hitchietter, who is the Strategic Initiatives Manager who works with me, with Dr. Minal Matani, who was the former Senior Advisor to the Provost on racialized faculty, and Dr. Nancy Heckman, who is in the Department of Statistics. My controls, here we go. And so the main take-home messages that I'm going to show you are shown right here. So what we did was we have closely tracked metrics on two particularly important groups within science. One is our existing faculty, which I'll show you, and the people who apply to become faculty members. The entire process of faculty recruitment is closely tracked. And the core finding that we made was that visible minority, as we refer to in Canada, or racialized faculty more accurately, have a larger diversity gap than female faculty. They're glaringly underrepresented in leadership, and they face gatekeeping during hiring, similar to women, but in a much greater fashion. And so just to set the landscape, given the audience is diverse and not necessarily all Canadian, there are two laws that govern hiring within the Canadian academic context. One is a federal law that defines 4 equity deserving groups. That's women, Indigenous or Aboriginal peoples, peoples with disabilities, and visible minorities. A key parenthesis I just want to make a note of, this term visible minorities is a Statistics Canada term, which is a demographic term, and it's defined under the Employment Equity Act as people who are non-white and non-Indigenous. All right, so it's somewhat different from the US definition, if that's what you're familiar with, and includes a much broader array of people. And so, and in addition, the Federal Employment Equity Act doesn't cover a 5th equity deserving group, and that is covered by provincial law. And in our case, British Columbia Human Rights Act covers sexual orientation and gender identity minorities, who I'll refer to as 2S LGBTQ+ individuals. And these as a whole are referred to as underrepresented groups. Today, I'm going to be mostly reviewing diversity as it applies to gender equity and racial equity. So science is fairly unique in UBC in that our annual employment equity census had a 73% response rate, and it allows us the capability of taking a very granular look at what we look like at the individual unit level. And so just taking 2 identity groups and looking intersectionally, both racialized identities and binary gender identities, what we documented was that, at least in the 2020 census, white males made up 58% of our faculty, white women 24%. Indigenous faculty, the numbers are so low we have to suppress the numbers under the Privacy Act. Anything less than 4 cannot be disclosed due to privacy reasons. Racialized women make up 6% of our faculty, and racialized men make up 11% of our faculty. So this total of racialized individuals of 17% is below the national average, which is about 21%. All right. Now, our overall diversity is shown here in this table. I just wanted to elevate the fact that we don't restrict ourselves just to race and gender. The other 3 equity groups are indicated here. But as I said, we're going to be focusing today primarily on race and gender. So our analyses allowed us to do something pretty, I think, perhaps novel. What we did was, in this case, we're looking at the gender diversity gaps in each individual unit. So science is made up of 9 academic departments and 3 institutes. And what we are doing, shown in bars of blue, is a benchmark, which is the US National Science Foundation data set on percentages of women in either postdoc or PhD level, depending on the specific unit and who they tend to recruit from. And in either orange or gray is the actual units' representation, gender representation representation. And what you can see is if it's in orange, it is statistically significantly divergent from the reference standard or the pool that's available. And what you can see is science as a whole is significantly divergent from the available pool at 15 percentage, about 10 percentage points off. And what you can see on the right is the differential between the existing faculty and the available pool. And so to the left of the 0 mark, you're in deficit, all right? And this is the first time, this is what progress looks like. 1 year ago, there were 3 units that were in orange. And fast forward to 2020, now you can see that there's only 1 unit where the available pool is significantly divergent by quite a large amount. It's possible that the others have smaller sample sizes, and so the error bars are quite large. But as you can see, for a large part, all departments sort of hover around the 0 mark, and that suggests progress. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have a long ways to go. I mean, in specific fields like physics and mathematics and computer science, the actual representation of women at the 15 to 20% mark is strikingly low and not reflective of the undergraduate population or the general population. And so where we're losing women in those specific subfields is a specific question for that unit to have to address themselves. Keep an eye out that not a single unit has numbers suppressed, which is going to be different when you take a look at racialized faculty. And that's in the next slide. So when we looked at racialized diversity in the Faculty of Science, this time we cannot use the US NSF data because the US definition of minorities is different from the Canadian definition. And so we used the next most proximate indicator that we had, which was to take the averages who'd applied to science in the individual units over the last 10 years from 2010 to 2019. And so perhaps that's not as representative as if a particular field is particularly discriminatory against visible minorities, but it's the most proximate indicator that we have. And so what you can see is that science historically had a fairly large pool of applicants who are visible minorities at 31%, and yet the diversity is under 20%. And that diversity gap is about 15 percentage points, all right? And what you can see is individual units with their racialized diversity shown over here have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units that are significantly divergent from the available pool, and that's plotted on the right side, where you can see the units in red, in orange. More interestingly, there's also 1, 2, 3, 4, and a 5th unit where there's 0 racialized faculty members self-reporting, and so that is far more dramatic in terms of a diversity gap than compared for the gender gap. And so we've made progress with respect to gender diversification, but not for racialized diversification. There's a suggestion, for example, that perhaps this is not a fair comparison because our reference standards are, in the 2010s, when recruitment of faculty could date back 35 years, and perhaps the available pool from 35 years ago is not what it is today. And so we thought, okay, let's do a reanalysis. I'm not going to show you that data, but we look strictly at assistant and associate professors, which is essentially hiring within the last 7 to 15 years. And it's certainly true that when it came to gender diversity, we had certainly improved things in the last 10 to 15 years. But when it came to racialized diversity, the shocking news was that 6 out of 12 units had 0 racialized faculty at either the assistant or associate professor ranks. That means that we've actually been doing worse in the last 15 years for racialized recruitment than we were historically. And so if you imagined in academia that merit was the sole basis on which we recruited individuals, you would expect a random distribution around the 0 mark, and that is not what we see. So that suggested to us that essentially that there was a systematic barrier for racialized candidates to be considered in academia. And so we addressed that by taking a close look at our hiring processes. And so within science, we track every step of the hiring process so that we can plot, for example, the representation in each one of those steps. And so if you focus your attention on the left, this is how women fare during the hiring process. And we're looking at about 7 years of hiring. So 47 searches ending up with 58 hires. So women make up historically about 21% of our applicant pool. They made up about 27% of who got shortlisted, made up about 24% of who gets offers, and about 26% of who we recruited or landed are female. All right, and so you can see that our women fare reasonably well compared to the available pool. In contrast, racialized candidates actually made up a larger fraction of the applicant pool at 31%. And yet, despite that, they made up less than 20% of those who got shortlisted. Once a racialized candidate got onto a shortlist, they fared reasonably well in getting offers at about 24%, and the landing rate was about 24%. And so those two numbers, I want you to remember, 26% and 24%, are our historical landing rate, our success at recruiting a given member of that underrepresented group in the process of hiring through that period of time. There's one other metric that was striking to us. We noticed that, well, before I get into that, a core difference that we observed was that if you were a solitary racialized candidate on a shortlist, your success in getting an offer or getting landed was far lower than if you were a solitary female candidate. A solitary female candidate has a landing rate about on par with their representation in the available pool, whereas a racialized solitary candidate had a dramatically lower chance of getting that offer than their representation of the available pool. Once you got to 1 to 2 or more individuals of that underrepresented group, their landing rate had a dramatic enhancement. The third and final metric that we observed is what I call the exclusion rate. We quantified how many of those searches had 0 women shortlisted at all. And out of those 47 searches, it was 1 in 6 searches that had complete exclusion of women, so about 15%. Shockingly to us, this was data that we were completely ignorant of, despite the fact we'd been collecting this data for a decade or more. Fully 1 in 3 searches completely excluded racialized candidates. So 31% of our searches in the past excluded racialized candidates. So if we were to prioritize the idea that we want to diversify our faculty, but we're completely ignorant of the fact that our actual process excludes one group at twice the rate of another group, despite the fact they make a larger proportion of that candidate pool, we have a problem. That's what systemic bias looks like. And so we know that interventions can improve outcomes. This was the data on racialized candidates. I'm going to show you the fact that a couple of the interventions, which I'll describe. In 2020, this is our second most newest data, the ones that we've analyzed and plotted. Despite a lower percentage of applicants in the candidate pool of about 24%, we had a better shortlisting rate of about 34%, and about 40% of those who got offers were racialized, and about 36% of those we landed were racialized. So things have gotten better, and it's broken down here in a more intersectional manner. So if you recall, our landing rate for women was 26%, and for racialized, not showing the data, was 24%. In 2019, if you just restrict yourself to open searches for women, it actually went up from 24% to 26% to 35%. And last year, for the first time, our landing rate exceeded 50% of those we recruited who were female. 71% of those we recruited were female. For racialized candidates, the picture isn't that good. It started out at 24%, it dropped to 15% in 2019, and then it went up to 36% in 2020. In brand new data, which I haven't just arrived 2 days ago, in 2021, the statistics are 75% of who we recruited were female, and 50% of who we recruited are POC. So for a long time, I said, the primary beneficiaries of our efforts have been women, which is what this slide says. And the results for racialized people was variable, and we weren't sure if we were making material change. And so the trend line starts to look positive. And if you're interested in the intersectionality of who gets these offers, this is the data from 2019. The largest group that got offers were white men, followed by white women, with very few that were IB-POC men or women. And in 2020, when the first year we started seeing a difference, the largest group that were recruited were white women, followed by IB-POC women, and then white men, with the racialized men being the smallest fraction. Now, much of what I've been describing so far has been diversity or representation. That's not really inclusion. So what about inclusion? So having a seat in positions of authority is really a marker of inclusion, which is necessary, although it's not sufficient, for a truly inclusive academy. And so what I'm showing here is a representation of diversity in the Faculty of Science leadership for the last 20 years. And what I'm doing is I'm showing person years to better reflect historical representation. And so what you can see is white males, who, as I showed you, made up 58% of the faculty, are overrepresented at all levels of leadership, at the headship level, at the associate dean level, and the dean level. White women, who made up 24% of the faculty, are underrepresented as heads, so that's shown here in pink, 11%, but they're well represented at the associate dean and the dean level. All right. Racialized women, who make up 6% of the faculty, are completely not represented on this chart. No woman of color has ever served as a head, an associate dean, or a dean. Racialized men, 11%, are underrepresented at all leadership levels. There's one male person of color, actually now two since July, who serves as a head. And I am the first and only racialized faculty member to serve in the dean's leadership until about 6 months ago, when a woman of color staff member was added as an assistant dean. It still remains true that no woman of color faculty member has served on the dean's leadership team. And that's something that we need to remedy. That data is borne out by a study by Genevieve Fuji-Johnson and Melinda Smith and others, where they analyzed 5 Canadian universities, 3 in British Columbia and 2 in Ontario. And what they documented was that at the lowest levels of leadership, at the program and chair and director level, at the heads and directors level, and at the associate dean level, the representation for this pretty broad diversity group of intersectional identities, for non-binary gender, for male, for white, non-white, and Indigenous peoples, the representation is about on par with the faculty representation. But once you get beyond the associate dean level, there appears to be a shift where both white males and white women are well represented at the senior most levels, but a bamboo ceiling appears where racialized individuals and Indigenous peoples are not well represented at the highest levels. And so this suggestion of the bamboo ceiling suggests institutions have a systematic barrier that excludes racialized peoples at the highest levels. So I want to make sure that we finish with the one element where it is vital that we address individual forms of bias, both implicit bias and explicit bias, but that won't be the full story. Because our efforts at changing individual behaviors will come squarely against the fact that systems exist not by accident. They're there because they were designed that way. And that's what structural bias or institutional bias fundamentally is. And so, this is a talk that's usually given to non-experts, unlike this crowd, but it's fundamentally a system of hierarchy and equity that's characterized by the preferential treatment, privilege, and power for the majority group at the expense of the minority groups. And you all know this. This shows up in disparities in graduation rates and imprisonment rates, dying in police custody, and then most recently dying of COVID. This last bit was the one thing that raised awareness at the federal level and the provincial government level that we have no data on race disaggregated metrics in the healthcare system in Canada. And so one cautionary note is that this book, The Equity Myth, which is written by 7 social scientists, captures the fact that the phenomenon that primarily white subgroups are elevated in equity efforts is borne out in the study of Canadian academia. And so these authors showed that as more universities in Canada embrace equity, they narrowed the focus down primarily to gender, such that white women were the main beneficiaries. And this is a term that Melinda Smith called white diversification. And we noted that in our own data and the study of leadership representation. So what I'm going to finish with is that inclusion cannot be a zero-sum game. In fact, our efforts at widening the lens to multiple groups led to elevation of inclusion for those groups, including women. We believe that the struggles that women have faced in addressing misogyny, pay and workload gaps are issues that are relevant to other groups as well. And it's imperative that we find common cause to elevate all equity-seeking groups to be able to meet their full potential, especially to those most disadvantaged. The system will not change unless everyone, especially people in the dominant group, recognize the deficits that exhibits and the loss of potential that means to the bottom line, and that we need you to be proactive to bring about the change towards a more equitable culture. So this approach is best summarized by the framework of intersectionality as conceived by Kimberly Crenshaw. And I'm going to want to finish with her call to action, where when feminism does not explicitly oppose racism, and when anti-racism does not incorporate opposition to the patriarchy, race and gender politics will end up being antagonistic to each other, and both interests would lose. And we know from how we've been conducting our work, by broadening that lens, we've essentially lifted votes for all groups. So my last 2 slides, the key lessons that we learned was that we know that hiring has a gatekeeping function, and there are a couple of things that we put into place that has enabled us to counter that. One is we never had a requirement for diversity statement until 2 years ago. And by doing so, we essentially, by putting it in both the job ad and asking all candidates to address this, this is now an objective criteria by which we can actually separate individuals that are otherwise equally ranked. If one individual describes how they're going to meet the university's priorities for equity, inclusion, and diversity, that individual can then be ranked at a higher level. I didn't show you this data, but our survey metrics do not just ask the question, do you identify as a visible minority? I didn't show you that data, I actually have it if you want to see it. But by asking a question about ancestry or the census subpopulations, essentially allowing people to indicate their racial identity groups, we have actually got a disaggregation of visible minorities. And what our data showed was there were two benefits to that. One is that we were systematically underestimating who the visible minority population was. People who are racialized do not always say yes to that question. And so we were underestimating by something like 20 percentage points. So actually our real applicant pool was about 52% racialized on average. And the other ability it gives us, of course, is this is the only way we're going to find out if there's anti-Black and anti-Asian discrimination or anti-Indigenous discrimination, by using a more nuanced survey. Expanding our shortlist, we know that anytime shortlists are smaller than 5, you're not going to have representative people on your shortlist. And having more than one underrepresented group has a marked benefit in outcomes. We have something that's called the second look. All shortlists have to be approved by 2 individuals in the dean's office, me being one of them and the ADHR. That accountability requires that if a search committee deviates significantly in their representation on their shortlist from the available pool, they're going to have to justify why that is. So if your pool is 30% female and you give us a shortlist that is 0 out of 5 female, we're going to say, where's the highest ranked woman? If she's 7th, you're going to bring that person in, because you're not going to have a non-representative pool as far as we're concerned. And so that accountability is ingrained now in science. There are no committees that think they can get away without question. And then finally, we require active learning. Our every search committee, just as Sheryl alluded to, has to do this training every year. It doesn't matter if you did it the previous year. It's an in-person, and it's active learning where we can talk about it during the Q&A, but we use scenarios to sort of walk people through decision making. So the key changes at the faculty level is having a demographic census that lots of people see the value in and participate. So if you have a 20% response rate like our sister faculty, which I won't name, you can't do the kind of analysis we've done. We need to make sure there's a culture shift. The conversations that we have in our training sessions, and Sheryl is, light years ahead of us, those conversations are where the culture shift happens. We are porting our attentions to Indigenous strategic plan priorities. That's actually our top priority in our own strategic plan is the Indigenous Strat Plan. Intersectionality is vital. If you're not looking at the full spectrum of individuals' identities, you're going to miss a lot. And then we need to go beyond diversity. What about inclusion? So that's leadership diversification. I didn't show you this data, but we track promotion and tenure for particularly for women and racialized minorities. We also track who are getting our awards. And then we're ramping up our mentoring and affinity groups with 2 different grassroots faculty level committees. Okay, I'm going to stop there and hand it over.
That is awesome. Thank you both. I'm going to introduce Francine Kermally. I should have mentioned at the beginning, she's co-moderating this session. So I'm going to pass it off to Francine to kind of lead us through the questions that people have putting in the Slido. But again, feel free to put more questions in or upvote the ones you see there.
Yes, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Sheryl and Ninan, for your awesome talks. They were so interesting. So I'm just going to kind of go through the most popular questions first. So the first one is actually for both of you. And the question is from Tony, and she's wondering, what do you see as some of the key differences between promoting EDI in an academic versus industry setting? And whoever wants to go first, feel free.
Ninan gave me the signal that I have to go first, so I guess it's me. I think the one thing that really stands out to me is, and I've had meetings with industry professionals who've also, like engineering companies that have reached out to me as well. There is this way in which they often talk about it, tying it into sort of the business side of things and the business case. I don't think we have that same kind of need to do it that way. I don't necessarily think that's the best way that industry should do it, but these are the types of questions that I get, and they can be somewhat frustrating conversations to have, but it seems like that's how leaders in industry are looking at it. I will also, if I could just indulge myself a little bit more, I've also observed a lot of companies talking about it, but not dedicating resources or personnel to actually do the work. That's actually quite similar in academia, but holding an AD and EDI position, I feel a bit privileged in that way. But there's a lot more talk and a lot little action.
Yeah, the difference in academia is particularly with scientists. You know, I work with a group of people that are extremely critical. They're data driven, which is why I think we've had some resonance with my work. But using the argument of diversity has a benefit is utilitarian. I mean, it works well in the corporate world because of the dollar sign to it. With academia, I think there's new data showing a benefit in terms of research outputs. But fundamentally, the appeal should be about justice. This is about social justice. It's the right thing to do. Benefiting from a system that privileges one group at the expense of others is not a really fair system. And Canadians, you know, have a sense of fairness that you can appeal to.
Yeah, totally, I agree. Okay, so Ninan, we'll stay at you. The next question is for you. And so this is from Sonia, and she's curious what you think are the correct targets for faculty gender race representation. So representation in the general Canadian population or local population. What are your thoughts?
I love that question.
And Sheryl, if you have thoughts, feel free to add to that as well.
I love that question because it's highly problematic that, for example, our CRC targets at UBC identifies people of color as not being a priority because we're at 22%, which is some sort of standard that is set, I think, from the Canadian General Consensus Census data. And that's highly problematic because both Toronto and Vancouver are no longer, you know, visible minority is not an accurate term because the lower mainland Vancouver, since the 2016 census, is now 50.5% POC and Indigenous. And the same is true for Toronto. And so the idea that UBC should be satisfied with a 21% benchmark for racialized faculty in a city that is 50% racialized is problematic to me. So I raised that question with a CIHR senior administrator, and the response was they recognize, for example, I've been asked if we're at UPEI, how do we possibly achieve racial diversity in a local context that's not nearly that diverse? And so the response is that local context is supposed to be what we use as a benchmark. So, you know, that has to be decided at a higher level than my pay grade, but I'm totally in favor of the local context. I don't think the national average is sufficient. It might be a low bar, and then we need to go beyond that, taking a look at local circumstances. I don't think a city is the right level. I think it's the region that university might draw from.
If I could just say a little bit more about that too, the context really matters. So in the Faculty of Applied Science, we have nursing, which is huge majority of women. And then we have engineering, which has a huge underrepresentation of women. And so, you know, making the case that we need more women in nursing is not going anywhere. And so these are the contextual considerations that I think we need to bring to this conversation.
Agreed.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you guys both for that. Okay, so the next question is for Sheryl, so we'll stay with you. And this is from Sonia, and she's wondering, can you please tell us a bit more about what the training content looks like, particularly the anti-racism and decolonization conversations?
Yeah, I mean, this is a work in progress, and we're still trying to figure out the best way to kind of have these trainings. I guess I'll say that the anti-oppression fundamentals training that we do with Backhow is very much, it's not as interactive. So I will make this distinction between sort of the sort of awareness level, introduce level, and then the develop and apply level of understanding. And so we have training for everyone where we really want to raise the floor. So everyone has some basic awareness. And then we're trying to build on top of that ways to really engage in these conversations. So in our anti-racism and teaching and leadership training, which is a 12-hour, 4-part training series, we do a lot of interactive exercises. You know, in our Indigenous initiatives one, people do a whole positionality statement. Like there's a lot more depth that we can get to. So it really depends on kind of the scale of the training. What we're trying to do now, I will say, is build out a program so that everyone has this sort of fundamental layer, and that's what kind of makes them a good citizen. And then we add on to that and get more interactive, and that's kind of the interpersonal level, which has a huge allyship component. And then the last level is this application level, where if you're doing teaching, what does that mean for you? If you're in leadership, how do you apply it? And so we're trying to build up this whole kind of program where there's increasing levels of sophistication and engagement around these concepts. I will just share one little story. Actually, we had this leadership subcommittee where we had several of our engineering department heads, and I'll say, you know, we've had 2 women in department head leadership in our history as a faculty. So it is all men. 6 out of 7 are white men. And we did like this boot camp where it was like, we're just going to get you comfortable being uncomfortable. So we did like a privilege walk. We had them listen to videos and share their feelings and do those kinds of things. We'd love to be able to do more of that.
I'll touch on what we do in our faculty hiring training. So it's mandatory. Some 3 units involve the entire faculty, so the entire department goes through it every year, which is challenging because they start complaining. Small minority of them will complain about it, and they'll bring it to me. But the minute I say it's the dean's, position, so you can take it up with the dean, they then stop. Right? 45 minutes out of the 90 minutes is spent in scenario explorations, and they don't hear it at first, but the scenarios are based on real events that have happened to me or to colleagues or have been said to me. So, I always start with something that has to do with gender. Now we've got 45 minutes is a short amount of time, but we start with one that involves people making statements about a woman who's got a, MacArthur Fellowship and saying, oh, and they do dismissive comments, which we all know happens. The issue, of course, is when they realize these are real events that have happened in science, a good fraction of them are shocked because there's always this assumption of innocence, right? That we're not that bad, that we are not racist, we're not sexist, we're not homophobic. And so, we do things like a scenario where a female who got a MacArthur Fellowship is dismissed by somebody saying, she got it because she was a woman anyway. And so they're forced to, they see the scenario build out in over 3 slides, and they spend 5 minutes of time talking in small groups, and they come back and they volunteer it. Many of these training sessions now cross multiple departments because I can only do so many in a month. And so they will come into any session they can, and they're sitting there with other people from other units. And so they they learn from others far, far better. The anti-racism scenarios involve one where somebody said to me, and now it's a scenario, I find Chinese people difficult to read because they don't look you in the eye, right? So that's one. There's another one where the committee is essentially reporting back on the diversity of their shortlist, which is what they have to do, and they're happy to report gender diversity, but they ignore the fact that the actual pool was, as the scenario plays out, was 28% racialized, and they had no racialized individuals. And so then the chair calls back, which has happened in real life, and says, well, we don't feel comfortable reporting on racialized diversity, but shouldn't we be colorblind anyway? So then it gives us these are real scenarios that then port over to fundamentals of, data on bias, data on what colorblindness, who that benefits when we are no longer willing to talk about race, who does that privilege, and then the one that has happened to me where an individual after the training, and I made this into a scenario, the chair said to me, I didn't know where I was because I was in the hospital, and I said, could you show me the way out? And the person says, yes, I better, because you never know what you might take with you, like the silverware, like the ideas around here. So it was essentially suggesting I had to be escorted out because I might steal stuff, right? So the rush to innocence is something that we puncture actively anytime I can. And our issue is that the one event we have got sanctioned for to do is this hiring sessions. And so, which is why, Sheryl, it's so admirable that you've expanded that to multiple settings. Different faculty who are committed to this keep raising this issue that we need to have more such sessions, not just where faculty recruitment is involved, but in all forms of faculty life. I'll pause there.
Wow, thank you so much. Sounds super powerful. It sounds like you're both kind of starting off with this awareness of increasing awareness of the bias that's happening. Okay, so thank you so much for that. So the next question is from Hillary. And so she asked, do you have measures of whether any of these various forms of EDI trainings are effective and don't lead to backlash or backfiring effects? Thoughts on that? And if anybody has any thoughts, feel free. Sheryl.
I'm confident that what I'm doing is working because we've got the data, right? That's the power of the data. Data is not sufficient unto itself. It's not the only thing you have to do. By having the data, we are seeing that shift in our recruiting successes. Is that backlash? There's always about 1 to 2 people a year that try to make a complaint about it, and it doesn't go anywhere. So, Sheryl.
Yeah, it really does depend on the context. The training that we do, like anti-racism and teaching and leadership in the Indigenous Initiatives program, those are all people who want to do it, and they're committing this 12 hours over several months. So those aren't, and we do collect data about how effective they are. This is where Greg Lockwood from the Equity Office helps us out a lot. In terms of the other things that we do, like we actually like to have a captive audience. So we will do like surveys in department meetings. So in my own civil department, we had a department meeting. At the end of it, everyone did a experience and competency survey. And we've done trainings in that way. And that's where I don't know. My feeling is most people are supportive, but I also know through other ways of communication that there might be some that aren't. I haven't felt a strong backlash yet, but I'm also somewhat removed. But it's something I do think about and try to really think about how I approach the training to kind of make it as open as possible. And we do come armed with data too. So our survey data, that's how so in civil engineering, we did the survey data. Then we had a 3-hour department retreat about EDI where we talked about it. Then we had a 5-hour department retreat where we talked about EDII. And so it's kind of a progression. So when you start with that data, you can really run, I think. And so that's what we're seeing now at the unit level. We're helping every unit to do this.
Got you. Thank you. Okay, so I think we just have a few minutes left, 3 minutes left. So we will probably have time for just one more question or maybe two. So the next most popular question is, can you, this is for both of you, can you please talk about your most effective way of addressing the I of EDI for marginalized students in STEM? Most effective.
We're both looking at each other. I mean, this is a really tough one. And I will say this is why we have focused so much on engagement activities and raising awareness and celebrating different kinds of things and supporting equity deserving groups and those communities having their own events. So we're really trying to look at the culture in that way. We don't know how effective it is. You know, like we do have the workplace experience survey and the other surveys. So we're just kind of getting up and running to a place where we will eventually know how we're doing. But those are the kinds of things that we're doing to kind of bring out this whole community feeling to it all.
Inclusion is the hardest thing to achieve, right? And we can do it with staff and faculty with some of the tools we have. Students are really difficult to identify with respect to hidden identities. And so, you know, having affinity groups is the way we think that could make a difference, but there is no mechanism to go and reach down to undergraduates who identify with a specific identity group. That has to come from them. So, you know, we've mostly focused our attention on faculty at this point. So we've had an annual Women in Science and Engineering lunch. We do it jointly with Applied Science with Sheryl. And then for the first time this year, we did an IB-POC lunch. You know, we have 39 faculty who are IB-POC. Maybe now it's gone to 44, something like that. And about 20 people showed up. It was the first time we'd ever done that. And it was really powerful. And so the extent to which, you know, IB-POC faculty feel siloed, that was all coming to the fore. And so our goal is, and we heard this from one of the speakers in the earlier session, that students feel that inclusion when they identify with faculty of an affinity group that's somewhat close to them, right? Both gender and race is what I heard. I think I gathered that, which was really heartening for me to hear. And so if enabling our faculty who are minoritized allows the capacity for students to see themselves and to feel included, that's the only thing that I can see. But it's not a perfect system, you know, it's not a direct system. In the dean's office, creating affinity groups was one thing that we thought about fleetingly and thought that would be so inappropriate for, you know, these old, you know, fogies setting up something for an identity group. It would just not work. It has to come from the students, right? So enabling that is what we need to do.
Awesome. Thank you so much, both of you. I think we're just out of time, so I think we're going to move it over to Tony now. But again, thank you, Sheryl and Ninan, for very interesting and insightful information to share with us. Thank you. And I think Tony now is going to close off for the day.
That's right. Yeah.